The morning in Neo-Veridia did not begin with a sunrise. Sunrises were expensive luxuries reserved for the high dwellers on the spire, those corporate gods who lived above the smog and the heavy, acid-tinged clouds of Ethelgard. Down here, in the industrial gut of the city, the morning began with the rhythmic thrum of the atmospheric scrubbers and the sound of me losing a verbal war with a sentient kitchen appliance. I called it the Mark VII percolator, but in my head, I called it the grumpy toaster's older brother. It was a hunk of salvaged scrap and copper wiring that I had jury-rigged 5 years ago to produce something resembling caffeine. Today, however, it was producing a sound like a dying starship's engine and refusing to yield a single drop of liquid. "Listen, you bucket of bolts," I muttered, leaning over the counter while the neon lights of the noodle shop downstairs flickered through our floorboards. "We have a contract. I provide the high-grade beans I spent half my weekly scrip on, and you provide the motivation for me to keep living. Do not breach the protocol." The machine emitted a hiss of steam that sounded suspiciously like a swear word in binary. It blinked a single red light at me, an error code that didn't exist in any manual. "You are negotiating with a non-sentient thermal unit again, Kay," a voice said from the kitchen table. It was a calm voice, like a cool breeze in a room full of exhaust fumes. I turned my head. Lyra was sitting there, her iridescent skin shimmering faintly in the dim light of the apartment. Her tail, long and elegant with silver-blue scales, was wrapped comfortably around the leg of her chair. She was reading a physical book, a rare, dusty thing made of actual paper, while sipping lukewarm water from a mug with a chipped rim. "It is not non-sentient," I said, pointing a screwdriver at the machine. "It is malicious. There is a ghost in the percolator, Lyra, a ghost that hates joy." Lyra looked up, her large amber eyes reflecting the flickering blue of the city's advertisements outside our window. After 5 years of sharing this cramped 60-square-meter box above Old Man Jax's Noodle Emporium, she had developed a specific look for me. It was a mixture of pity, amusement, and the kind of patience usually reserved for training a particularly slow-witted domestic pet. "Perhaps it simply requires a new circuit gate," she suggested. "Or perhaps you should stop shouting at it before the neighbors call the enforcers again." "The enforcers do not care about domestic disputes between a man and his coffee," I grumbled. "They are too busy shaking down the street vendors for protection scrip." I gave the machine a final desperate thump. To my utter shock, it gurgled, whirred, and began to drip a dark, fragrant liquid into the pot. I raised my hands in silent triumph, looking at Lyra like I had just cracked the encryption on a sovereign data vault. "Strategy," I whispered. "Violence is not a strategy, Kay," she replied, turning a page. "It is a temper tantrum." I poured the coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the faded logo of a defunct lunar mining colony, and leaned against the counter. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, streaked with the white trails of cargo shuttles heading for the orbital docks. It was an ordinary Tuesday. We had rent due in 3 days, the air filter needed replacing, and Lyra was still the most mysterious person I had ever met, despite 5 years of shared laundry and burnt toast. When she had shown up at my door 5 years ago, she had been soaked to the bone by an acid rainstorm, carrying nothing but a small, reinforced case and a look of profound exhaustion. She told me she was a refugee from the inner systems, running from a family dispute that had turned ugly. In Neo-Veridia, everyone is running from something. I didn't ask questions because she had enough scrip for the first 6 months of rent, and she didn't mind that I spent my nights hacking into local grid nodes to keep the lights on. She was the perfect roommate. She was quiet. She never complained about my habit of leaving dismantled drones on the dinner table, and she possessed a strange, innate dignity that made even our peeling wallpaper look like a deliberate aesthetic choice. Then there was a sound at the door. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't the heavy-handed thumping of the debt collectors or the frantic scratching of the street rats. It was a chime, a pure, crystalline note that resonated through the very structure of the building. It was a sound that didn't belong in a slum. It was a sound that belonged in a cathedral or a high court. I froze, the coffee mug halfway to my lips. "That is not the mailman," I said, my voice dropping an octave. Lyra didn't move, but I saw it, the subtle change. The scales on her tail tightened, and her posture went from relaxed to terrifyingly rigid. The amber in her eyes seemed to deepen, catching a light that wasn't there a second ago. "Kay," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "Do not open the door." "Too late," I said, though I hadn't moved. The door didn't wait for an invitation. A small, silver disc, no larger than a dinner plate, drifted through the solid metal of the door as if it were smoke. It was a Wraith drone, a piece of technology so advanced that even mentioning it in the wrong parts of the city could get you voided. Its surface was a liquid chrome, swirling with patterns that looked like shifting constellations. It hovered in the center of our living room, ignoring me entirely. It turned toward Lyra. A thin beam of violet light swept over her, scanning the genetic markers in her skin, the resonance of her bone structure, the unique frequency of her Aurelian heart. The drone emitted a soft click. A compartment slid open on its underside, revealing a single envelope made of iridescent vellum. The envelope didn't just have a seal, it had a pulse. A soft, rhythmic golden glow emanated from the wax, which bore the crest of a weeping sun. "The Ethel sovereignty," I whispered, the coffee in my hand suddenly feeling like lead. The drone dropped the letter onto the table, right next to Lyra's chipped mug and her dusty book. Then, without a sound, it turned into a fine silver mist and evaporated into the recycled air of our apartment. We sat in silence for a long minute. The percolator hissed one last time. Downstairs, I could hear Old Man Jax yelling at a delivery bot. The world was still turning, but inside this room, the air had become heavy enough to drown in. Lyra reached out. Her fingers hovered over the vellum for a second, trembling almost imperceptibly, before she broke the seal. The golden light flared, illuminating the cracks in our ceiling, turning our dingy kitchen into a hall of radiance. She read the letter once, then twice. Her face didn't crumble. It didn't show fear. It became a mask of cold, crystalline stone, the face of someone who had stopped being a roommate and had become a monument. "Kay," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 kilometers away. "Yeah?" I managed to choke out. "I believe our lease is about to be terminated." I set the coffee down before I dropped it. "What does it say, Lyra? And don't give me the family dispute line. That drone just used a phase shift to walk through a 3-inch steel door. That was sovereign-grade tech. That was I Rule 12 systems tech." She looked at me, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw the truth behind the Aurelian refugee. I saw the weight of stars in her gaze. "My council has found me," she said quietly. "They are not asking me to come home, Kay. They are telling me that the throne is empty, and the empire is burning." I looked at the letter, then at the broken percolator, then back at the woman I had lived with for half a decade. "So," I said, rubbing my face, "should I cancel the grocery delivery for tomorrow? Or are we hosting a royal banquet in a room that smells like cheap noodles?" Lyra didn't laugh. She just stared at the weeping sun on the vellum. "It appears," she whispered, "that I am no longer a refugee. To understand how a man who spends his nights bypassing municipal power grids ends up living with a galactic monarch, you have to understand the night we met. It wasn't romantic. It didn't involve a ball or a glass slipper. It involved a dumpster, an acid storm, and a very sharp knife. 5 years ago, Neo-Veridia was going through one of its cleansing cycles. The corporate overlords decided the slums were getting too crowded, so they turned off the atmospheric stabilizers for 48 hours. The result was a downpour of chemical sludge that could eat through a standard raincoat in 10 minutes. I was huddled in the alleyway behind Jax's shop, trying to salvage a burnt-out processor from a discarded cleaning bot. My lungs were burning, and my hood was starting to smoke from the acidity. That was when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the alley, completely still. No coat, no umbrella. The acid was rolling off her skin like water off a polished stone. She was staring at a neon sign for a synthetic protein bar like it was a holy relic. "Hey!" I had shouted over the roar of the rain. "You want to die out here? That stuff'll melt your skin off, lady." She had turned to look at me then. She didn't look scared. She looked curious, like she was conducting a scientific experiment on how much pain a person could endure before losing their mind. She reached into her tunic and pulled out a blade that shimmered with a faint, humming energy. "I do not wish to die," she had said, her voice cutting through the storm with impossible clarity. "I simply have nowhere else to be." I had looked at her blue-silver skin, the way her tail flickered with agitation, and the sheer raw power radiating from her. I was a street rat with a backpack full of illegal parts. I should have run. Instead, I opened the heavy service door to my apartment and gestured inside. "I have a couch," I said. "It's lumpy, and it smells like ozone, but it doesn't melt people." She had followed me in, and she never left. Now, 5 years later, that same woman was sitting at my table, her royalty stripped bare by a glowing piece of paper. The transition was jarring. It was like finding out your favorite worn-out pair of boots was actually made of dragon skin. "Kaylin," she said, breaking the silence of the present morning. "You are staring. It is impolite." "I am staring because my roommate just got a biological notification that she's the queen of everything," I snapped, the sarcasm finally returning as my shock began to wear off. "Give me a break, Lyra. You told me you were a clerk." "A clerk?" "I was a clerk of sorts," she said, her tail twitching. "I managed the affairs of a very large office." "An office with 12 solar systems," I muttered. "Did you have a nice break room? Did the coffee machine work there?" "The Sovereign Palace has fountains of liquid light and servants who anticipate your every desire," she said, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of genuine sorrow crossed her face. "But no one there ever told me that I was being an idiot for trying to fix a toaster with a fork. No one there ever made me laugh until my lungs hurt because of a bad movie about space pirates." I felt a strange, sharp pang in my chest. For 5 years, I had been her anchor. I had taught her how to navigate the black markets, how to avoid the enforcers, and how to find the best dumplings in a 3-kilometer radius. I had given her normal. And now, normal was being vaporized by a silver disc. "So, what happens now?" I asked, leaning over the table. "Do they send a fleet? Do we get a parade? Or do the assassins show up first?" "The letter says the High Council will arrive within the hour," Lyra said. "They have tracked the signature of the drone. They are coming to negotiate my return." "Within the hour?" I looked at the sink, which was currently holding a week's worth of unwashed dishes. "Lyra, We have 3-day-old noodle broth in there. I haven't vacuumed the floor since the great dust storm of last month. We are not royal audience ready. It does not matter, Kay. They are coming for a queen, not an interior decorator. She stood up, and for the first time I noticed how she carried herself. The slight slouch she had adopted to fit into the low ceilings of the slum was gone. She stood tall, her head held high, her tail coiled with a regal precision. She looked like she could command the stars to move, and they would probably apologize for being in her way. I felt a sudden, cold realization. When they took her, I would be back to being just Kalen Vance, the guy who fixed drones and ate dinner alone. The 5-year dream was over. "Lyra," I said, my voice softer now, "you don't have to go. You're a refugee, remember? We can leave. I know a guy who can get us a transport to the outer rim. We can be gone before they even land." She walked over to the window, looking out at the smog-choked horizon of Neo-Veridia. I saw her reflection in the dirty glass, a queen in a 5-credit tunic, standing in a room that cost less than her crown's smallest jewel. "I ran once," she whispered. "I ran because I thought the sovereignty was a cage. I thought that if I left, the corruption and the hunger for power would disappear. But the letter, it contains more than just a summons, Kay. What else? The Dust Eater has been unsealed." I felt the blood drain from my face. Even on the streets of Neo-Veridia, we knew the legends. The Dust Eater wasn't a bomb. It was a molecular deconstructor. It was a weapon from the First Age, designed to turn entire planets into fine gray powder. It had been banned for 10,000 years. The usurpers, my cousins, they have found the activation codes, she continued, her voice trembling now. But the final sequence requires the genetic imprint of the reigning monarch. They are not coming to negotiate, Kay. One faction wants me to lead them. The other wants to use my blood to unlock the end of the world. I stepped toward her, grabbing her shoulder. "Then we definitely need to leave. If they want your blood, staying here is suicide. If I leave, they will find another way. Or they will simply burn every world I have touched until I surrender. Including this one. Including you." The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a story about a hidden queen. This was a war, and it had just landed on my doorstep. The air outside the window suddenly began to ripple. The heavy smog of Neo-Veridia was pushed aside by a massive invisible force. A shadow, vast and terrifying, began to blot out the meager light of the morning. It wasn't a shuttle. It was a sovereign dreadnought, a kilometer-long spike of black glass and shimmering energy, descending through the clouds like the hand of an angry god. "Kay," Lyra said, turning to face me. "One last thing." "Yeah?" The coffee was actually quite good this morning. I tried to find a sarcastic comeback, something about charging her extra for the beans, but the words wouldn't come. The building began to shake. The percolator fell off the counter and shattered on the floor. The council had arrived. The descent of a sovereign dreadnought is not something you hear so much as something you feel in your marrow. It is a tectonic shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, oppressive weight that makes the air taste like burnt ozone and old pennies. Imagine a mountain made of obsidian and starlight deciding to park itself directly over your head, and you will have a faint idea of why my teeth were vibrating. The street below went silent first. The constant rhythmic shouting of the noodle vendors and the screeching of the maglev trains simply evaporated, replaced by a low-frequency hum that made the water in Lyra's cracked mug dance in concentric circles. I looked out the window and saw the sky being swallowed. The ship was a jagged splinter of black glass, stretching for over a kilometer, its hull pulsing with a deep violet light that seemed to suck the color out of the surrounding neon signs. "K," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fact that the floorboards were groaning under the gravitational displacement. "You should probably put on a shirt. A clean one." I looked down at my grease-stained tank top. I spent my days elbow-deep in the guts of malfunctioning power conduits. I didn't exactly have a gala wardrobe ready for the end of my life as I knew it. I scrambled toward the closet, tripping over a pile of dismantled sensor arrays. "A shirt? Lyra, we are being invaded by a floating palace, and you are worried about my fashion choices. They are probably going to vaporize the building just to clear a landing zone." "They will not vaporize the building," she said, her eyes fixed on the door. "The High Council is many things, but they are obsessively polite about their grand entrances. They will use the elevator." "The elevator?" I yelped, pulling a wrinkled gray tunic over my head. "The elevator has been broken since the great power surge of last October. It moves at the speed of a dying snail. Then they will have a very long time to contemplate their impatience," she replied. I checked my reflection in a shard of mirror taped to the wall. I looked like a man who had been dragged through a jet engine and then told he had to pay taxes on the experience. My hair was a nest of dark tangles, and I had a smear of conductive gel on my cheek that refused to come off. I looked at Lyra. She hadn't changed her clothes. She was still wearing the faded blue tunic she bought for 3 credits at the Sunday Bazaar. Yet somehow, she looked more intimidating than the dreadnought outside. A chime echoed through the room. It was the same crystalline note from before, but this time it was louder, vibrating through the sink and the crooked bookshelf. "They are in the hallway," Lyra whispered. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the counter. It was a stupid, instinctive gesture. You don't fight an interstellar empire with a piece of industrial plumbing. But I didn't know what else to do. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. 5 years. We had lived in this dump for 1,825 days, and not once had I seen her look as lonely as she did in that moment. The door didn't slide open. It dissolved. The metal simply transitioned from a solid state into a fine, glittering mist, revealing 3 figures standing in our cramped, dim hallway. They were tall, reaching nearly 2 meters in height, with the same silver-blue skin and long, elegant ears as Lyra. But where Lyra's skin was soft and matte, theirs was polished to a high sheen, decorated with intricate geometric tattoos that glowed with a faint internal luminescence. They wore robes of woven light, actual, programmable photons that shifted from deep emerald to royal gold as they moved. The air around them smelled like mountain air and expensive incense, a sharp contrast to our apartment's natural scent of frying oil and damp insulation. The figure in the center stepped forward. He was older, his ears tipped with frost-white fur, his eyes the color of a dying sun. He carried a staff made of a dark, singing metal that vibrated in harmony with the ship above. He didn't look at the peeling wallpaper. He didn't look at the pile of dirty dishes or the broken percolator on the floor. He looked directly at Lyra, and then he did something that made my brain short-circuit. He knelt. The 2 advisors behind him followed suit, their heads bowed so low their ears touched the grimy carpet. "Sovereign Lyraean Solvane," the old man said, his voice a deep, resonant cello that seemed to vibrate in my very lungs. "The stars have grown dim in your absence. The 12 systems are in mourning." Lyra didn't move. She didn't offer them a hand to rise. She stood there with her arms crossed, her tail lashing back and forth in a slow, dangerous arc. "Rise, Chancellor Valerius," she said, and her voice had a cold, metallic edge I had never heard before. "You are getting dirt on your silk, and this apartment is far too small for such dramatic displays of fealty." The old man, Valerius, stood up slowly, his joints clicking with a sound like dry twigs. His gaze finally shifted to me. It wasn't a look of anger or even curiosity. It was the look a gardener gives to a particularly stubborn weed. "And this creature?" Valerius asked, the word creature dripping with so much disdain I felt like I needed a shower. "Is this the reason the light of the Ethel has been hiding in a gutter for 5 cycles?" "He's not a creature," Lyra said, her voice dropping an octave. "His name is Kalen Vance. He is a master of the grid, and the only reason I am not currently a smear of carbon in an alleyway. You will speak to him with the respect his hospitality deserves, or you can find your own way back to the spire." Valerius stiffened. The tattoos on his neck flared a bright, angry red. "My apologies, Majesty. My concern for your safety has made my tongue sharp." "Yeah, well, keep it behind your teeth," I muttered, tightening my grip on the wrench. "We don't get many Majesties in Neo-Veridia. Usually, people just knock and ask if we have any spare power cells." The Chancellor ignored me, turning his attention back to Lyra. "We have been searching for 60 months, Lyraean. The usurpers, the faction led by your cousin Malachor, they have taken the capital. They have turned the high spire into a fortress of glass and blood. They are searching for the Dust Eater codes." Lyra's expression didn't change, but I saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the table. "If they have the weapon, why do they need me? I am a ghost. A memory. They have the weapon," the second advisor, a woman with eyes like cold sapphires, spoke up. Her voice was clipped and professional. "But the machine is stubborn, Majesty. It was forged in the blood rites of the First Age. It will not accept a command from anyone whose genetic resonance does not match the direct lineage of the soul vein. Malachor has the machine, but he does not have the key." "And I am the key," Lyra whispered. "You are the sovereign," Valerius corrected. "Without you, the Dust Eater is just a tomb of ancient technology. With you, it is a tool of absolute peace. Or absolute destruction." I stepped forward, my boots crunching on a stray piece of glass. Wait. You want to take her back so she can turn on a world killer? Are you out of your minds? Look at her. She's been eating synthetic noodles and arguing with a coffee machine for 5 years. She doesn't want your throne. She doesn't want your war." The Chancellor turned his head toward me, his eyes narrowing. "You understand nothing of the great balance, grid jumper. If the Queen does not return to stabilize the resonance, the weapon will eventually decay. And a decaying Dust Eater does not simply stop working. It leaks. It will turn the entire sector into a cloud of gray ash, including this miserable rock you call home." I looked at Lyra. "Is he lying?" She didn't look at me. She was staring at the weeping sun on the letter. "No, Kay, he's not lying. The Dust Eater is a living thing, in its own terrible way. It needs a prime anchor to keep its molecules bound. Without a sovereign to command it to sleep, it will wake up on its own. And it will be hungry." The room felt suddenly much colder. The Dust Eater wasn't just a political threat. It was a biological ticking clock. "We must depart immediately," Valerius said, gesturing toward the door. "The dreadnought is prepped for a jump sequence. The local authorities have been compensated for the disruption." Lyra looked around the room. She looked at the crooked shelves I had built for her books. She looked at the stain on the couch from the time I had tried to teach her how to play void ball, and we had spilled an entire bottle of blue soda. She looked at the life we had built out of scraps and stubbornness. "I need 10 minutes," she said. "Majesty, we do not have—" Valeria started. 10 minutes, Lyra snapped, and the air in the room actually crackled with a surge of static electricity. "Or I stay here, and we can all watch Ethelgard turn to dust together." The Chancellor bowed his head, though his face was a mask of fury. 10 minutes, then. We will wait in the hall." The three figures stepped back, and the door misted over once more, sealing us inside. I stood there, feeling the wrench heavy in my hand, feeling the 5 years of my life slipping through my fingers like sand. "So," I said, my voice cracking, "this is the part where you go and save the galaxy, right?" "Kay," Lyra said, walking over to me. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like the woman who had lived with me for 1,800 days. She took the wrench from my hand and set it on the counter. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "When I left, I thought that by removing myself, the power struggle would end. I thought if there was no queen, there would be no reason to fight over the crown. I was a fool. You can't run from who you are, especially when your DNA is a series of launch codes." "You could stay," I said, knowing it was a lie, even as I said it. "We could go to the sublevels. The heavy down there is so thick not even their scanners could find us. We could disappear." "And watch everyone in this city die?" Lyra asked, her eyes searching mine. "Watch Old Man Jax and the kids in the alleyway turn into dust because I was too afraid to face my family?" I looked away. "No, you wouldn't do that. That's why you're the queen, I guess. Because you're the only person I know who actually cares about what happens to people like us." She reached into her tunic and pulled out a small, silver object. It was a data chip, old and worn. "This has the encryption keys to all the accounts I've kept hidden for 5 years. It's enough script to buy this building, enough to get you out of Neo-Veridia, enough to live 1,000 lives where you never have to jump a grid again. I didn't take it. I don't want the script, Lyra. I want you to not get KIA on some floating palace, because your cousins are chrome-headed lunatics." She smiled, a small, sad movement of her lips. "I am an Aurelian, Kay. We are very hard to kill, especially when we have something to come back to." She leaned in and pressed her forehead against mine. It was an Aurelian gesture of deep trust, of shared breath. In that moment, the noise of the dreadnought and the smell of the ozone faded. It was just us. Two people in a room that had seen too many arguments and not enough sunlight. "I am coming with you," I said. She pulled back, her eyes wide. "No, it is too dangerous. You are a civilian. You are a human. They will treat you like a pet or a prisoner." "I'm a grid jumper," I corrected her, my jaw setting. "I've survived 3 electrical storms and a gang war over a shipment of synthetic yeast. I know how to fix things that are broken, Lyra. And from what that old man said, your empire is the biggest broken thing in the universe. Besides, who's going to fix your coffee machine in the palace?" "Kay," she started, her tail lashing. "I'm not staying here to watch the sky turn gray," I said, cutting her off. "If we're going to be voided, we might as well do it together. That's the deal, right? Roommates to the end." She looked at me for a long time, her amber eyes searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. She reached out and took the data chip back, tucking it into her pocket. "It will be gritty," she said, using a word I had taught her years ago. "It will be bloody, and the Chancellor will try to have you flatlined the moment I look away." "Then don't look away," I replied. She laughed, a sharp, sudden sound that broke the tension. She walked to the door and waved her hand. The mist dissolved. The three advisors were waiting, their expressions impatient. "We are ready," Lyra announced. The Chancellor looked at me, then at the small bag I had grabbed, stuffed with a few tools and a spare shirt. "And the human?" "The human is my attendant of technology," Lyra said, her voice dripping with royal authority. "He is under my personal protection. If a single hair on his head is harmed, I will forget the codes to the Dust Eater. Permanently." Valerius looked like he wanted to argue, but the threat of the weapon was a heavy silencer. He bowed stiffly. "As you wish, Majesty." We walked out of the apartment, down the hallway where the wallpaper was peeling, and into the elevator. For the first time in history, the elevator was working perfectly. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of our home. The broken percolator was still on the floor, a small puddle of coffee spreading across the tiles like an oil slick. It was an ordinary mess in an ordinary room, and as the elevator dropped, I realized that I was leaving the only world that had ever made sense to me, heading for a sea of stars that didn't care if I lived or died. But I wasn't alone, and in the end, that was the only code that mattered. The interior of the Sovereign Dreadnought was not what I expected. I had spent my life inside the guts of industrial machinery, greasy, cramped, and smelling of hot copper. This place was different. It didn't feel like a ship. It felt like a dream someone had had while staring at a cathedral. The corridors were wide enough to fly a cargo shuttle through, the walls made of a translucent, bone-white material that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent rhythm. There were no visible wires, no clicking relays, no hiss of hydraulics. Everything was silent, smooth, and terrifyingly efficient. We were moving at 10,000 kilometers an hour toward the orbital gate, but I couldn't feel a single vibration in the floor. "It's too quiet," I whispered to Lyra as we were led toward the central sanctum. "It feels like we're inside a giant lung." "It is a biomechanical hybrid," Lyra replied, her voice hushed. "The ship is alive, Kay. It has its own nervous system. It's not just transporting us. It's feeling us." "That's not creepy at all," I muttered, adjusting the strap of my tool bag. "I feel like I'm being digested." We were flanked by 4 guards. Wraiths, they called them. They wore armor made of shifting shadows that seemed to swallow the light around them. They didn't walk. They drifted, their feet barely touching the floor. They were the elite, the killers who had spent 5 years failing to find the woman currently walking in front of them. We reached a set of massive doors that looked like they had been carved from a single, gargantuan pearl. Chancellor Valerius turned to us, his expression grim. "Majesty, the High Council has convened in the Star Chamber. They are anxious. The reports from the capital are worsening. Malachor has begun the primary ignition sequence for the Dust Eater. He cannot fire it yet, but he is charging the resonance chambers." "How long?" Lyra asked. 48 hours, perhaps 60. Once the chambers are at full capacity, the weapon will begin to pull matter from the surrounding space just to maintain its stability. If it isn't locked by then, the feedback loop will become irreversible." Lyra nodded, her face a mask of iron. "Then let us see them." The doors slid open, and the scale of the room inside nearly knocked me over. It was a hemisphere of glass, or something like it, revealing the vast black void of space. We were already out of the atmosphere. Below us, the planet Ethelgard looked like a bruised grape hanging in a sea of ink. Above us, the stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in the fabric of the universe. 12 figures sat in a semicircle of floating chairs. They were the heads of the great houses, the people who decided the fate of billions. They looked at Lyra with a mixture of reverence and desperation. And then they looked at me, and the air in the room became thick with judgment. "Who is the short-lived one?" one of the council members asked. A man with skin the color of tarnished silver and a voice like grinding stones. "Why is a human in the star chamber?" "He is my witness," Lyra said, her voice echoing through the vast space. "A witness to what?" another asked. "To your shame? To the 5 years you spent hiding in the mud while your empire bled?" Lyra didn't flinch. She walked into the center of the circle, her footsteps loud in the silence. "I spent 5 years learning what it means to live without a crown. I spent 5 years seeing the universe through eyes that were not blinded by starlight and ancient tradition. And what I saw was that we have forgotten the people we rule. We have become so obsessed with the great balance that we have ignored the billions who are just trying to survive another day in the dark." She gestured toward me. "Kalen Vance is a man who fixes things. When something is broken, he doesn't hold a council. He doesn't debate the philosophical implications of a burnt-out fuse. He picks up a tool and he makes it right. The sovereignty is broken, and I am here to fix it." There was a long, tense silence. The Chancellor stepped forward, his staff singing a low, mournful note. "Fixing an empire is not like fixing a grid node, Lyraean. The Dust Eater is not a fuse. It is a god. And it is angry." "Then let us go to the capital," Lyra said. "Let us face Malachor." "We cannot simply fly into the capital," the sapphire-eyed advisor, Saren, said. "The orbital defenses are under Malachor's control. A single dreadnought, even a Wraith class, would be zeroed before we reached the upper atmosphere." I cleared my throat. It was a small sound, but in that silent chamber, it sounded like a gunshot. Everyone turned to look at me. "What if you didn't fly in?" I asked, my voice shaking just a little bit. The silver-skinned man laughed. "And how else would we arrive? Should we walk through the void?" "No," I said, stepping forward, ignoring the way the wraiths shifted their weapons. "You have a Cortex bridge system, right? The one that connects the ship's nervous system to the planetary grid for data syncing?" The Chancellor narrowed his eyes. "Yes, it is for information transfer. Not for physical transport. I spent 5 years hot-wiring the grid on Ethelgard just to keep our heater running," I said, gaining confidence as I thought about the logic of the wires. "Data is just energy. Matter is just energy. If you can sync a data stream from orbit to the capital, you can piggyback a phase shift signal on top of it. You don't send the ship. You send a ghost packet, a small group of people, phased out of reality, traveling along the communication lines." "That is impossible," Saren said. "The biological trauma of such a transit would flatline a human in seconds. Even an Aurelian would struggle." "Not if you use a buffer," I countered. "You use the ship's life support system to wrap the packet in a protective resonance field. It's like putting a message in a bottle before you throw it into a hurricane. I've done it with repair drones. I've sent a drone from the North Pole to the South Pole of Ethelgard in 3 seconds using nothing but the old telegraph lines." "You are suggesting we treat the Queen of the 12 Systems like a repair drone?" Valerius asked, his voice trembling with outrage. "I'm suggesting we get her into the palace without being blown out of the sky," I snapped. "Unless you have a better idea?" Lyra looked at me. She knew I was improvising, but she also knew I was the best gearhead she had ever met. She knew that I had once fixed her book reader using a piece of chewing gum and a discarded sensor lid. "Can you do it, Kay?" she asked. "I can build the bridge," I said, "but I'll need access to the ship's primary core. and I'll need someone who knows the capital's internal grid map. I know the map, Saren said, her eyes flashing with a sudden interest. I designed the security protocols for the spire. The Chancellor looked around the room. He saw the desperation on the faces of the council. He saw the black void outside and the ticking clock of the Dust Eater. Very well, he said, his voice heavy with defeat. Prepare the bridge. If this fails, Grid Jumper, there will not be enough of you left to bury in the mud. The next few hours were a blur of high-tech insanity. I was taken to the heart of the ship, a chamber filled with pulsing violet liquid and floating neural links. It was beautiful and terrifying, a cathedral of biology and light. Saren worked beside me, her movements precise and cold, her long ears twitching as she manipulated the light displays. "You are a strange creature, Kalen Vance," she said as I rerouted a series of power conduits. "You have no status, no longevity, and yet you act as if you belong here." "I don't belong here," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "I belong in a crappy apartment with a broken coffee machine. But the woman I live with happens to be your queen, so here I am. Why do you follow her? You clearly don't like her much." "I follow the crown," she replied. "The Soul Vein bloodline is the only thing that keeps the 12 systems from tearing each other apart. Without a sovereign, we are just 13 warring tribes with too many weapons. So it's not about her? It's just about the blood?" "Blood is the only thing that lasts," Saren said. "Choices are fleeting. Feelings are static. But the blood is the history of our people." I stopped working and looked at her. "That's where you're wrong, Saren. Blood just tells you where you came from. Choice tells you where you're going. Lyra didn't choose to be your queen, but she's choosing to save you anyway. And I'm choosing to help her. That's worth more than 1,000 years of history." Saren didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. For a second, I saw a flicker of doubt in her sapphire eyes, a small crack in the cold armor of her tradition. The bridge was ready. We gathered in the transit chamber, Lyra, myself, Saren, and 2 Wraith guards. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air humming with the massive energy needed to phase us out of reality. "Kay?" Lyra said, taking my hand. Her skin was cold, her grip tight. "If this doesn't work, if we don't make it to the other side." "It'll work," I said, though my stomach was doing backflips. "Just remember what I told you about the transit. Don't fight the pull. Just let the energy carry you. It's like falling into a dream. And if I don't wake up, then I'll be right there to shout at you until you do," I said, offering her a shaky smile. The Chancellor raised his staff. The violet liquid in the chamber began to glow with a blinding intensity. The walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by a roaring tunnel of light and sound. I felt a sudden, violent tug at the base of my skull. My vision fractured, the stars outside the window turning into long streaks of white fire. I felt my body becoming weightless, my molecules stretching and thinning as we were pulled into the data stream. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Lyra's heartbeat, rhythmic and steady against the chaos of the void. And then there was a sudden, jarring stop. We slammed into a hard, cold floor. The air was different here. It was sterile, dry, and smelled of ozone and old blood. I opened my eyes and saw a massive hall of glass and silver, but the glass was shattered and the silver was stained with dark streaks. We were in the high spire, the heart of the capital, and we were not alone. Dozens of soldiers in crimson armor stood in the shadows, their weapons leveled at our heads. In the center of the hall, sitting on a throne of jagged obsidian, was a man who looked exactly like Lyra, but with eyes that held no light, only a cold, consuming hunger. "Malachor," Lyra whispered, standing up slowly. "Cousin," the man replied, his voice a silky purr that made the hair on my neck stand up. "You are late. The Dust Eater is hungry, and I believe you brought me the key." He looked at me, his gaze lingering on my human face, with a look of bored cruelty. "And you brought a pet. How charming. I wonder if his blood tastes as bitter as his world." I stood up, my knees shaking, but I didn't back down. I reached into my bag and pulled out my wrench. It was a pathetic weapon against a room full of laser rifles, but it felt solid in my hand. "He's not a pet," Lyra said, her voice rising until it filled the hall with a command that made the soldiers flinch. "He is my family, and you are going to regret touching a single hair on his head." The battle for the stars had begun in a room made of glass and blood. And as I looked at Lyra, standing tall against the darkness, I realized that I didn't care about the 12 systems or the Great Balance. I only cared about the woman who had shared my noodles and my dreams, and I was going to make sure she made it home, even if home was now a palace in the middle of a war. The throne room of the High Spire did not feel like a place of government. It felt like a mausoleum for the living. The walls were made of that same translucent, bone-white alloy I had seen on the Dreadnought. But here, the light was sickly and dim, pulsing with a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of a dying heart. It was a cathedral of absolute order, where every shadow seemed regulated by a decree, and every breath felt like an act of trespass. Malachor sat on the obsidian throne with the casual, predatory grace of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. His silver-blue skin was etched with tattoos of such complexity they seemed to move under his skin like restless snakes. He didn't look like a revolutionary or a usurper. He looked like a masterpiece of genetic engineering that had somehow lost its soul in the manufacturing process. "You always did have a penchant for the dramatic." "Lyraean," Malachor said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my brain. "To arrive via a ghost packet. It's a suicide's gambit. And yet, here you are, looking as though you've spent the last 5 cycles scrubbing the floors of a warehouse." Lyra didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the shattered glass, her blue-silver skin glowing with a defiant light. Her tail was dead still now, a silver spear pointed at the ground. I stood half a step behind her, clutching my heavy wrench like it was a holy relic. I felt like a cockroach in a jewelry box, conspicuous, unwanted, and likely to be crushed at any moment. I spent those cycles learning the difference between ruling and reigning. "Malachor," Lyra replied, her voice echoing off the high, arched ceiling. "You have the throne, but the spire is cold. The people of the 12 systems aren't singing your name. They are holding their breath, waiting for the sky to fall. The sky is not falling, cousin. It is merely being rearranged," Malachor said. He stood up, and the 24 guards in crimson armor shifted their weight in perfect unison. It was a terrifying display of discipline. No one breathed. No one blinked. They were less like men and more like extensions of his will. He stepped off the dais and walked toward us. His eyes drifted over Lyra and landed on me. The disgust was palpable. It was a cold, academic loathing, the way a biologist might look at a fungal infection on a rare specimen. "And this biological error?" he asked, gesturing toward me with a hand that ended in long, manicured claws. "Is this the pet the council mentioned? The one you've been sharing your living quarters with?" "His name is Kalen," Lyra said, her voice dropping into that dangerous register that usually preceded her breaking someone's nose. "And if you call him a pet again, I will forget how to be diplomatic." Malachor laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You've gone soft in the mud, Lyrian. You've forgotten that our blood is sacred. We are the architects of the stars. To mingle your life with a creature that lives for 80 cycles and dies in its own filth, it is more than a scandal. It is an evolutionary insult." "Listen, Chrome Dome," I said, the words slipping out before my common sense could tackle them. "I've seen better-looking things than you crawling out of the sewers in Neo-Veridia. You might have the fancy chair and the light show, but you look like you haven't had a decent night's sleep in 3 decades. Maybe it's the guilt. Or maybe it's just that stick up your—" "Kay?" Lyra whispered, a warning. The guards didn't move, but the air in the room suddenly grew heavy. A pressure settled on my chest, making it hard to draw breath. It was a localized gravity well, a subtle display of palace technology designed to remind me that I was a fly in a room full of swatters. "It has spirit, I will give it that," Malachor said, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "But spirit is a poor substitute for longevity. Tell me, human, do you know what your queen really is? Do you know why she is the only one who can unlock the Dust Eater?" "She's a sovereign," I gasped out, the pressure on my lungs increasing. "It's a blood thing. We've been over this." "It is more than blood," Malachor said, stepping closer until I could smell the faint metallic scent of his skin. "The soul vein are not just rulers. We are the biological anchors for the Great Balance. The Dust Eater was not built to be a weapon. It was built to be a reset button. In the First Age, when the systems became chaotic and the lesser species began to outbreed their usefulness, the Sovereign would use the device to prune the garden." The pressure on my chest vanished so suddenly I stumbled forward. Lyra caught my arm, her grip bruising. I looked at her, searching for a denial, but her eyes were fixed on her cousin. "Pruning," I repeated, my voice hoarse. "You mean genocide? You're talking about wiping out entire planets because they aren't orderly enough." "Order is the only thing that prevents entropy," Malachor said. "Your world, Ethelgard, is a prime example of entropy. It is a breeding ground for filth, crime, and biological stagnation. Under my reign, and with Lorrain's genetic signature to stabilize the weapon, we can cleanse the sector. We can start again. A galaxy of light, without the shadow of the primitive." "You're insane," I whispered. Malachor ignored me, turning back to Lyra. "The Council didn't bring you back to stop me, Lyrian. They brought you back because they realized I was right. Valerius and the others. They are tired of the decay. They want the Golden Age back. They want the garden pruned. They just didn't have the stomach to tell you." Lyra's face went pale. I looked back toward the entrance, where Saren and the guards were standing. Saren wouldn't look at us. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her ears flat against her head. "Is it true?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. "Did the Council know?" "Valerius was the one who suggested it," Malachor purred. "He knew you wouldn't come back for a throne, but you would come back to save a friend. The human was the perfect bait, a tiny, fragile life to pull you back into the orbit of the spire." The room felt like it was spinning. Everything I had thought I knew about this rescue mission was collapsing. The Council hadn't found Lyra because they loved her. They hadn't brought me along because I was a technological attendant. I was a hostage. I was the emotional leverage they needed to get their queen to sit in the chair and pull the trigger on 1 billion lives. Lyra turned to me, her eyes filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. "Kay, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said, reaching out to touch her hand. "But we have to move. Now." "Move where?" Malachor asked, gesturing to the room full of guards. "You are in the heart of the sovereignty. There is nowhere to go that I do not own." He waved a hand, and the guards stepped forward, their weapons humming. They didn't aim at Lyra. They aimed at me. "You have 48 hours to contemplate your heritage, Lyrian," Malachor said. "I will let the human live for now. His presence seems to keep you focused. But if the codes are not entered by the third sunrise, I will feed him to the atmospheric scrubbers while you watch. One limb at a time. Take them to the gilded suites," he commanded, "and lock down the grid. I want no more ghosts in my spire." The guards surrounded us. I looked at Lyra, who seemed to have retreated into a cold, silent place deep inside herself. As we were led out of the star chamber, I caught a glimpse of Seren. She looked at me for a fraction of a second, and in her eyes I didn't see the cold tradition of an advisor. I saw a flicker of horror. Maybe the garden wasn't as orderly as Malachor thought. The gilded suites were essentially a 5-star prison cell. The walls were made of amber-colored glass, and the furniture was carved from some kind of organic silk that molded itself to your body. There were no windows, only holographic displays of a perfect, cloudless sky, a cruel irony given the smog-choked reality of the world below. Lyra hadn't spoken since we were locked in. She sat on the edge of a floating bed, her tail wrapped tightly around her waist, staring at the floor with an intensity that could have bored a hole through the spire. "Lyra," I said, pacing the length of the room for the 100th time. "Talk to me. We need to figure a way out of here." She didn't look up. He was right, Kay. About the council. About everything. I was so desperate to believe they needed me for the right reasons that I didn't see the trap. "I brought you here to die." "Hey, look at me," I said, kneeling in front of her. I took her hands in mine. Her skin was freezing. "You didn't bring me here." "I chose to come. Remember? Choice? That thing I was lecturing the sapphire-eyed lady about? I'm a big boy, Lyra. I knew the risks. Well, okay, I didn't know the world-ending molecular deconstructor risks, but I knew it was going to be heavy." She finally looked at me, her amber eyes swimming with tears. "Why? Why would you choose this? You could be in Neo-Veridia right now. You could be eating noodles and complaining about the rain." "Because the noodles taste like cardboard when I'm eating them alone," I said, trying to force a smile. "And because you're my family, Lyra. Not the 'we have the same tattoos' kind of family. The 'I'll help you hide from the government for 5 years' kind of family. That's the only kind that matters." She let out a shaky breath and leaned her forehead against mine. For a moment, the prison cell disappeared. We were back in the apartment, safe and small and ordinary. Then, the reality of the ticking clock came rushing back. "Okay," I said, pulling back. "We have 48 hours, or 47, depending on how long we've been sitting here. Malachor thinks he's locked down the grid, but he doesn't know how humans build things. Aurelian tech is all bioorganic, right? It's all connected, like a giant brain." "Yes," Lyra said, her eyes sharpening as she followed my logic. "Every suite is a node. Every wall is a sensory cluster." "Exactly. And like every brain, it has a back door, a subconscious. I saw the layout when we were coming in. They have physical service conduits for the atmospheric scrubbers. They're old, metallic, and completely disconnected from the neural grid, because the Aurelians think manual maintenance is for primitives." "You want to go into the vents?" Lyra asked, a hint of her old amusement returning. "That is a very street slang way of approaching a palace escape." "It's a classic for a reason," I said, standing up and scanning the ceiling. "Somewhere in this room, there's a localized air intake. If I can get in there, I can find the primary junction box. I might not be able to unlock the door, but I can definitely make the palace think there's a fire in the star chamber, or a leak in the kitchen. Or maybe I just turn off the gravity in Malicor's bedroom. Lyra stood up, her tail uncoiling. I cannot fit in the conduits, Kay. My tail. The scales are too sensitive to the heat of the scrubbers. I know. You stay here. Act like you're contemplating your heritage. Make them think you're broken. I'll go in, find a way to jam the Dust Eater's charging sequence, and see if I can find Saren. Why Saren? Because she looked like she wanted to vomit when Malicor was talking about pruning the garden, I said. She's old school, but I don't think she's a murderer. If we can get one person on the council to flip, we might have a chance. I found the intake behind a decorative panel made of woven light. It was a tight squeeze, about 30 centimeters across, and it smelled like ancient dust and recycled breath. I grabbed my bag, checked the charge on my multi-tool, and looked back at Lyra. If I'm not back in 2 hours, tell them I died doing what I loved, I said. Which was? Being a nuisance to people in power. I scrambled into the vent, the metal cold against my skin. It was a labyrinth of dark, narrow tunnels that twisted and turned through the skeleton of the spire. I moved by touch, feeling for the vibration of the fans and the hum of the power lines. This was my world. The dark, the grease, the hidden pathways of the grid. I felt more at home in these vents than I did in the gilded suite. As I crawled, I began to see the true state of the sovereignty. Through the slats of the air vents, I saw the guards in the hallways. They weren't just disciplined. They were terrified. I saw servants huddled in corners, whispering about the gray mist that was coming. Malicor hadn't just taken the throne. He had turned the palace into a pressure cooker. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. After 40 minutes of crawling, I reached a primary junction. It was a massive room filled with glowing blue fibers, the ship's nervous system. It was beautiful, but it was also vulnerable. I pulled out my tool and began to scan for the Dust Eater's power signature. It wasn't hard to find. It was a massive, jagged spike of energy that made my sensor scream. It was being fed from the spire's central core, a constant stream of high-density particles that were being pumped into the weapon's resonance chambers. If I cut this, the whole palace goes dark, I whispered to myself. But that would just trigger an emergency lockdown. I need something subtler. I need to give them a phantom reading. Make the system think it's full when it's actually empty. I started to strip the casing off a bundle of neural fibers, my fingers moving with a precision I hadn't used since my days in the agency. I was deep in the zone, lost in the logic of the machine, when I heard a sound behind me. It was the soft, rhythmic clicking of claws on metal. I froze. I didn't breathe. I slowly reached for my wrench, my heart hammering against my ribs. It is a very dangerous thing, to touch the nerves of a god, human. I spun around, my wrench raised. Saren was standing at the edge of the junction room, her sapphire eyes glowing in the dark. She wasn't wearing her robes of light. She was in a simple black tunic, and she looked exhausted. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I am the architect of the spire, Kaelin Vance. Did you truly think I would not notice a biological contaminant in my ventilation system? Are you going to call the guards?" Saren walked closer, her gaze fixed on the frayed neural fibers in my hand. "If I wanted you dead, I would have vented the oxygen from your suite an hour ago. No, I am here because I have lived for 300 cycles, and in all that time, I have never seen a species as stubborn as yours." She looked at the weapon's power signature on my sensor. "You are trying to jam the resonance. It will not work. The Dust Eater has its own subconsciousness. It will sense the deception and override the manual controls. Then, tell me what will work, I said, stepping toward her. Tell me why you're here instead of helping Malachor prune the garden. Saren's ears twitched with a sudden, sharp pain. My daughter lives on the colony of Velonis Prime, she said, her voice cracking. It is a mixed colony. Humans, Aurelians, Lyronians. They live together in what Malachor calls entropy. She has a child, a little girl with ears that are slightly too short, and a laugh that sounds like bells. She looked at me, and I saw the humanity, or the Aurelian equivalent, shining through the cold tradition. If the Dust Eater is fired, Velonis Prime will be the first to go. It is on the list of inefficiency. I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost fell over. A mother. Even in an empire of starlight and obsidian, it came down to a mother wanting to protect her kid. Then help us, I said. Lyra doesn't want to rule, but she'll do it if it stops the killing. We need to get her to the weapon's core. Not to activate it, but to rewrite the biosignature. If we change the lock, Malachor will never be able to fire it. Rewrite the signature? Saren asked, her eyes widening. That would require a total genetic overwrite. It would mean the Solvane bloodline would no longer be the key. The sovereignty would have no biological anchor. The empire would change. It would become a democracy of choice, not a hierarchy of blood. Good, I said. The blood thing wasn't working out anyway. Saren stared at me for a long time. She looked at the neural fibers, then at the flickering sky above us, and finally at the small human hand reaching out to her. Choice, she whispered, the word sounding foreign in her mouth. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was cold, but it was firm. We have 24 hours before the final charging phase begins, she said. I can get you into the core, but I cannot protect the Queen. Malachor has the Wraiths. They are bonded to his will. We will have to fight our way in. I can handle the tech, I said, a grim smile spreading across my face. And Lyra? Well, you haven't seen her when she's been deprived of her morning coffee. She's more dangerous than any Wraith. Let us go, then, Saren said, turning back toward the shadows. Let us see if your choice is stronger than our history. As I followed her back through the vents, I thought about Lyra. I thought about the broken mug and the blue soda stains. I realized that we weren't just fighting for an empire. We were fighting for the right to be ordinary, for the right to live in a world where your value wasn't written in your DNA, but in the people you chose to love. And as we crawled through the dark, I knew one thing for certain. I was done being a biological liability. It was time to show the Aurelians what a human master of the grid could really do. Crawling back through the ventilation shafts of the high spire felt like dragging my soul through a cheese grater. My knees were raw, my palms were slick with a mixture of sweat and conductive grease, and every time the atmospheric scrubbers cycled, a blast of freezing, recycled air threatened to knock me off the narrow ledge. But the weight of the wrench in my back pocket and the cold, steady hum of Saren's voice in my earcom kept me from losing it. You are 30 meters from the primary intake of the Gilded Suite, Kaelin, Saren whispered. Her voice was thin, filtered through 3 layers of encryption I had hot-wired into the palace's internal comm hub. The Wraith guards have shifted their rotation. You have a window of exactly 90 seconds before the thermal scanners recalibrate. 90 seconds, I grunted, pulling myself forward with a strength I didn't know I had. Easy. I've bypassed municipal security grids in Neo-Veridia faster than that while holding a bag of stolen dumplings. Do not be arrogant, human. The spire is not a slum. If you are caught, I cannot protect you. I am already committing high treason by speaking to you. I reached the vent cover above our suite and peered through the slats. Lyra was exactly where I had left her, sitting on the edge of the silk bed, her tail coiled like a spring. She looked smaller than she had an hour ago, draped in the oppressive luxury of the room. I tapped 3 times on the metal. She was at the vent in a heartbeat. Her amber eyes found mine in the dark, and for a second, the crushing weight of the Empire seemed to lift. "Kay," she breathed, "you're alive." "Barely," I said, unscrewing the panel with my multi-tool. "We have a situation. Saren is with us. Or at least, she's not against us. She's worried about her daughter on Velonis Prime." Lyra's ears twitched. "Saren has a child?" "A hybrid," I said, kicking the vent cover open and dropping into the room. I landed in a heap, my joints popping like bubble wrap. Apparently, the golden age Malachor wants doesn't include kids with short ears. "We have to move, Lyra. Saren can get us to the core, but we have to go now." Lyra helped me up, her grip firm. "What is the plan?" "We're going to rewrite the rules," I said, wiping a smudge of grease off my forehead. "We're going to the Dust Eater's heart, and you're going to give it a new set of instructions. We're going to strip the bloodlock. No more Solvane keys. No more pruning the garden. We turn that thing into an expensive piece of orbital junk that anyone can turn off. That will destroy the foundation of the sovereignty," Lyra said, her voice filled with a strange mixture of fear and relief. "The houses will fall into chaos." "Better chaos than a galaxy of gray ash," I snapped. "Besides, you told me once that the best way to fix a broken circuit was to bypass the damaged component entirely. Your bloodline is the damaged component, Lyra. It's the thing everyone is fighting over. So we remove it." She looked at me for a long, silent moment. Outside, the artificial sky of the suite flickered, a sign that the dreadnought above was drawing even more power for the weapon's final charge. "You're right," she said, her voice hardening. "For 5 years, I tried to be nothing. Now, I will be the last of everything." The door to the suite hissed open. It wasn't Saren. It was a wraith. The guard was a towering shadow, his armor absorbing the light of the room until he looked like a hole in reality. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for a password. He simply raised a hand, and a blade of violet energy erupted from his gauntlet. "Kaelin! Get back!" Lyra screamed. She moved faster than I could track. She didn't have a weapon, but she had 5 years of living in Neo-Veridia's sublevels, where being a queen didn't mean squat if you couldn't dodge a shiv. She slid under the wraith's first strike, her tail whipping around to catch him behind the knee. The guard stumbled, his armor let out a hiss of venting gas, and he swung blindly with his energy blade. I didn't think. I just acted. I lunged forward and jammed my multi-tool, set to a high-frequency overload, into the gap between the guard's helmet and his chest plate. The reaction was instantaneous. A cascade of blue sparks erupted from the wraith's armor. He let out a choked electronic gurgle as his sensory array fried. I scrambled back as the shadow armor collapsed into a pile of inert gray metal. "Is he dead?" I gasped, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. "Zeroed," I said, the street slang feeling heavy on my tongue. "Or at least his suit is. He's going to have a hell of a headache when he wakes up." "We have 40 seconds, Kaelin." Saren's voice crackled in my ear. "The guard's vitals link has gone flatline. The entire floor is going into lockdown." "Then we don't go through the halls," I said, grabbing Lyra's hand. "We go through the guts." "Saren, open the maintenance hatch in the floor. Now!" A panel near the bed slid aside, revealing a vertical shaft filled with glowing blue cables. Without hesitation, we jumped. The slide down was a frantic blur of heat and light. We were falling through the nervous system of the spire, surrounded by the thoughts and commands of an empire. I could feel the weapon charging, a deep, subsonic vibration that made my teeth ache. We hit a landing 3 levels down, stumbling out into a room that looked like a forest of glass. "This is the primary conduit," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. It was beautiful and terrifying. Thousands of glass tubes ran from the floor to the ceiling, filled with a swirling silver mist. This was the fuel for the Dust Eater, pure, unrefined molecular energy. It was enough power to rebuild a world or erase one. And standing at the end of the hall, silhouetted by the silver light, was Serin. She held a pulse pistol in her hand, her ears pinned back in an expression of pure terror. "You are late," she said, her voice shaking. "Malachor has reached the 70% threshold. The resonance is becoming unstable. If we do not reach the core in the next 20 minutes, the feedback loop will begin." "Then stop talking and lead the way," I said. We ran. We ran through the heart of the spire, past automated turrets that Serin disabled with a flick of her wrist, past servants who fled in terror at the sight of their queen covered in grease and sweat. We weren't a royal procession. We were a heist crew. We reached the final blast door, a massive disk of obsidian etched with the weeping sun. "This is it," Serin said, her hand hovering over the control panel. "Beyond this is the core. Malachor is already there. He has the remaining wraiths." Lyra stepped forward, her blue-silver skin shimmering in the dim light. "Serin, if we do this, if I rewrite the signature, you know what happens to the Council." "I know," Serin said, her gaze meeting Lyra's. "We will lose our status. We will lose our history. But my daughter will wake up tomorrow. That is a trade I will make 10,000 times over." She pressed the sequence. The obsidian door groaned, the ancient magnets protesting as they were forced apart. The air that rushed out was freezing, smelling of ancient stone and static. We stepped into the core. It was a void, a massive, hollow sphere at the center of the spire, with a single pulsing orb of white light suspended in the middle. The orb was the Dust Eater's heart. It was surrounded by a ring of floating platforms, and on the highest one, Malachor stood, his hands outstretched as if he were embracing a god. "You are persistent, cousin." Malachor's voice boomed through the sphere, amplified by the resonance chambers. "I thought the human would have broken by now. But it seems he has infected you with his stubbornness." "It's called loyalty, Malachor," I shouted, the sound lost in the vastness of the room. "You should try it sometime. It's better than having to pay people to not stab you in the back." Malachor looked down at us, his eyes glowing with an artificial violet light. "Loyalty to a gutter? Loyalty to a species that burns itself out in 80 cycles? You have forgotten your place, Lyraean. You are the sovereign. You are the architect of order. And you are going to give me the codes." The wraiths began to drift from the shadows, their energy blades humming. There were 6 of them. Too many for a wrench and a pulse pistol. Lyra looked at me, then at Serin, and finally up at the pulsing heart of the weapon. "Kay," she whispered, "hold them off. Just for 3 minutes." 3 minutes? I asked, looking at the looming shadows. "Lyra, I'm a repairman, not a soldier. You are the man who fixed a sentient percolator with a screwdriver," she said, her voice filled with a sudden fierce pride. "You can handle a few ghosts." She didn't wait for an answer. She leaped onto one of the floating platforms, her tail providing the balance she needed to navigate the shifting gravity. she began to climb toward the heart, her movements a blur of silver and blue. Malachor roared in fury. "Kill the human! Bring me the queen!" The wraiths lunged. I stood my ground, my multi-tool in one hand and my heavy wrench in the other. My knees were shaking, and I was pretty sure I was about to be turned into a localized pile of carbon, but as I looked at Lyra reaching for the white light, I realized she was right. I was a master of the grid, and this whole palace was just one big, overcomplicated circuit. "Come on then, you chrome-headed freaks," I yelled, my voice cracking with adrenaline. "Let's see how you handle a little bit of Neo-Veridia static." The first wraith moved like liquid smoke. He was on me in a second, his violet blade whistling through the air where my head had been a fraction of a heartbeat before. I rolled across the cold obsidian floor, the impact jarring my teeth, and lashed out with the wrench. I caught the guard across the forearm, or where the forearm should have been, and felt the satisfying crunch of shadow armor buckling. He didn't scream. Wraiths don't scream. They just emit a low-frequency hum of displeasure. He swung again, a backhand strike that would have zeroed me if I hadn't ducked into the shadow of a massive power conduit. "Saren!" I yelled, firing my multi-tool at a nearby sensory node. "Give me some cover!" The sapphire-eyed advisor was already moving. She had found a terminal at the edge of the platform and was frantically bypass coding the gravity stabilizers. A section of the floor beneath the remaining wraiths suddenly buckled, sending two of them tumbling into the lightless void below the core. "The human is right," Serene shouted, her voice high and frantic. "The spire is just a machine, and machines can be lied to." High above us, Lyra had reached the central ring. She was inches away from the pulsing white orb of the Dust Eater. Malachor was screaming now, a raw, primal sound that had nothing of the Golden Age in it. He lunged at her, his claws extended, but Lyra caught his wrists in mid-air. They were locked in a struggle of blood and history, two sovereigns fighting for the soul of an empire. "You would destroy us all for a pet," Malachor hissed, his face inches from hers. "You would throw away 10,000 years of order for a creature that doesn't even have a soul link." "His soul is worth more than your entire empire, Malachor," Lyra shouted back, "because he chose me when I was nothing. He didn't need a bloodlock to be kind." I took a hit. A glancing blow from a wraith's blade caught my shoulder, the heat cauterizing the wound instantly, but sending a white-hot spike of agony through my nervous system. I fell to one knee, the world spinning. I could smell my own burnt skin, and for a second, the darkness at the edge of my vision started to close in. "Kaylin!" Lyra's voice pierced through the haze. I looked up. She was holding the orb now. Her skin was glowing with a blinding white light as the Dust Eater began to read her genetic sequence. The entire spire was screaming, a high-pitched whine that felt like it was going to shatter my skull. "I'm okay," I croaked, pushing myself up. "Just finish the job." I looked at the wraith standing over me. He was raising his blade for the final strike. I didn't have the strength to roll away this time. I closed my eyes, waiting for the cold, violet end. The strike never came. Instead, there was a sound like a thunderclap, followed by a sudden, jarring silence. The violet light of the wraith's blade vanished. The humming of the armor stopped. I opened my eyes and saw the guard standing frozen, his shadow plate turning into a dull, lifeless gray. All around the room, the technology was dying. The turrets powered down. The lights dimmed. The gravity wells collapsed, sending us all drifting an inch off the floor in the sudden weightlessness. Lyra had done it. She was floating in the center of the sphere, her hand still resting on the orb. But the orb wasn't white anymore. It was a soft, warm amber, the color of her eyes. "The blood lock is broken," she said, her voice echoing through the core with a resonance that felt like a bell. "The Dust Eater is no longer a weapon of the soul vein. It is a tool of the people. From this moment on, it will only activate if the consensus of the 12 systems is reached. No one man, no one bloodline." Malachor was drifting nearby, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. You've killed us?" he whispered. "You've turned us into commoners." "No, Malachor," Lyra said, drifting toward him. "I've turned us into people. Now, you can finally find out if anyone actually likes you for who you are, or if they were just afraid of your DNA." I managed to grab onto a railing, pulling myself back toward the main platform. Saren was there, her face wet with tears, watching as the glowing light of the Empire faded into something softer, something more human. "We did it," I said, leaning my head against the cool metal. "You did it, Kaelin Vance," Saren said, reaching out to steady me. "You brought the Queen back, and then you taught her how to abdicate. I believe that is a record for your species." The spire was still in lockdown, but the atmosphere had changed. The oppressive weight was gone. As we made our way back toward the star chamber, we saw the guards removing their helmets. They looked confused, frightened, but also curious. For the first time in their lives, they weren't being told what to think by a neural link. We reached the star chamber just as the sun, the real sun of Ethelgard, was beginning to break through the acid clouds of the horizon. It was a pale, sickly thing, but it was light. The council was waiting. Valerius looked like he had aged 100 years in the last hour. He looked at Lyra, then at me, then at the empty space where the great balance used to sit. "The houses will not accept this," he said, his voice a mere shadow of its former self. "There will be war." "Then let there be war," Lyra said, stepping toward the glass wall. "But it will be a war fought by people who have a choice, not by biological slaves. And I suspect that when they realize they don't have to die for a crown, they might just decide to go home instead." She turned to me. She was covered in dust, her tunic was torn, and she had a cut on her cheek that was bleeding silver blue. She looked exhausted, broken, and utterly magnificent. "So," I said, rubbing my sore shoulder, "what's the move, Majesty? Do we find a new palace, or are we going back to the noodles?" Lyra looked at the horizon, at the city of Neo-Veridia waking up below us. She looked at the millions of ordinary lives that were still turning, unaware that the galaxy had just been saved by a human with a wrench. "I think," she said, taking my hand, "that I've had enough of palaces for one lifetime. But I believe we still owe Old Man Jax for the last week of rent." I laughed, the sound echoing through the halls of the crumbling empire. "Yeah, and we definitely need a new coffee machine. I think I saw a Mark 8 model in the palace kitchens that we could borrow." As the dreadnought began its slow descent back toward the city, I realized that the Golden Age wasn't something you built out of starlight and obsidian. It was something you built in the small moments, in the shared meals, the bad movies, and the stubborn refusal to let go of the people you chose to love. We weren't the architects of the stars. We were just two roommates, heading home to fix the dishes. And as the first real rays of sunlight hit the glass of the spire, I knew that for the first time in 5 years, we were finally free. The silence that followed the collapse of the bioorganic grid was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of a heartbeat. For 10,000 years, the high spire had hummed with the collective consciousness of a bloodline, a low-frequency vibration that told every Aurelian in the sector exactly where they stood in the great balance. Now, that hum was gone. replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind through the shattered glass of the star chamber and the ragged breathing of people who had forgotten how to exist without a psychic leash. I stayed on the floor for a long time, my back against a cooling power conduit, watching the violet light drain out of the walls. My shoulder was screaming at me, a jagged white-hot reminder that energy blades don't care about your personal history. But I didn't move. I just watched Lyra. She was still standing in the center of the room, her hand hovering inches away from the amber orb of the Dust Eater. She looked like she was made of glass herself, fragile and luminous. The glowing tattoos on her skin had dimmed to a soft, pulsing silver. And for the first time in 5 years, her tail wasn't lashing or coiling. It just rested on the floor, still and silent. Is it done?" I croaked, my voice sounding like I had been gargling industrial solvent. Lyra turned her head. The cold, royal mask was gone, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it made her look 100 years older. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like someone who had just finished a double shift at a deep-core mining facility. "It's disconnected, Kay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The genetic anchor is shredded. The Dust Eater is just a machine now. A very expensive, very dangerous heap of ancient scrap." Across the room, the wraiths were beginning to move. Without the neural link from the Sovereign, they weren't the elite, terrifying shadows of the Empire anymore. They were just men in heavy suits, looking around with a confused, blinking desperation. One of them took off his helmet, revealing a young face, barely 20 years old, with ears that were trembling. He looked at Malachor, who was still drifting in the low-gravity pocket near the ceiling, and then he looked at Lyra. He didn't bow. He just sat down on the floor and buried his face in his hands. Malachor was the only one who didn't seem to understand the memo. He was clawing at the air, trying to reach a control panel that was no longer responding to his DNA. "You've voided us!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You've killed the history of the Aurelians. We are nothing now. We are just commoners." Lyra walked toward him, her footsteps light on the obsidian floor. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the same pity she used to have for the stray cats in the alleyway behind Old Man Jax's shop. "We were always commoners, Malachor," she said. "We just had better lighting. You spent so much time worrying about the garden that you forgot to look at the flowers. You wanted to prune the universe because you were afraid of the mess. But the mess is where the life is." I managed to push myself up, using my wrench as a cane. Saren was there, her sapphire eyes wide as she watched the dreadnoughts in orbit begin to drift. Without the central command of the spire, the fleet was in a state of digital shock. "The houses will be in a frenzy," Serene muttered, her fingers dancing over a dead terminal. "There is no line of succession. There is no biological mandate. We are going to have 100 civil wars by breakfast. Then start talking to them. Saren," Lyra said, turning to her, "tell them that the weapon is dead. Tell them that the Queen is dead. Tell them that if they want to rule, they have to convince people to follow them, not just show them a blood sample." Saren looked at the Queen, the woman who had just committed the ultimate act of high treason against her own DNA. "You are truly not coming back?" "I'm going home," Lyra said, and she looked at me. My heart did a weird little flip, the kind that had nothing to do with gravity wells or electrical shocks. "I have a roommate who still owes me 3 credits for last month's hydro bill." I coughed, trying to hide the fact that my eyes were getting suspiciously misty. 4 credits, I corrected. "And I'm pretty sure the interest rate on interstellar salvation is astronomical." The Chancellor, Valerius, was the last to find his voice. He had been standing in the shadows, his staff of singing metal now silent and cold. He looked at Lyra with a mixture of horror and a very reluctant, very buried respect. "You have broken the world, Lyraean soul vain," he said. "No, Valerius," I said, stepping forward until I was standing beside her. "We just unstuck the grid. It's going to be a bumpy ride for a while, but at least the lights are on." The descent back to Neo-Veridia was a far cry from our arrival. There were no ghost packets or high-speed data transits this time. We took a standard diplomatic shuttle, a sleek silver bird that felt remarkably solid compared to the nightmare we had just walked through. Saren was at the helm, her daughter's name a constant prayer on her lips. She didn't talk much, but every time she looked at me in the rear-view display, she nodded. It was the first time an Aurelian had ever looked at me like I wasn't a biological error. We broke through the cloud layer of Ethelgard just as the second sun was setting. The city of Neo-Veridia was a sprawling, glittering carpet of neon and smog, and for the first time in my life, it looked beautiful. It looked like home. We didn't land at the spire. We didn't land at the government docks. We landed on the roof of a dirty 3-story building in the middle of the industrial district, right above a shop that smelled like 5 different kinds of frying oil. Saren powered down the engines. The silence that followed was different this time. It was a natural silence, filled with the distant sounds of sirens, maglev trains, and someone yelling about a parking violation 3 blocks away. "This is where you stay?" Serene asked, looking at the rusting water towers and the peeling advertisements for synthetic protein. "It's got character," I said, grabbing my bag. "And the rent is cheap." Serene looked at Lyra. "You will be hunted, you know. There will be those who want to restore the old way." "Let them try," Lyra said, stepping out of the shuttle. "I've spent 5 years learning how to disappear in this city. I think I'm pretty good at it." She turned back to Saren. "Go to your daughter. Tell her the sky isn't going to fall today." Saren didn't say anything. She just touched her forehead in that Aurelian gesture of deep trust, and then she lifted the shuttle back into the dark purple sky. We watched her go until she was just another spark among the stars. "Well," I said, looking at the service door to our apartment, "that was a hell of a Tuesday." Lyra laughed, a real, genuine laugh that didn't have a single drop of royal ice in it. "It is Wednesday now, Kay. You've been away for nearly 24 hours. I groaned, clutching my shoulder. "Great. I probably have 50 missed messages from the Grid Council about that power surge in Sector 7. We walked down the stairs, our boots clattering on the metal steps. The hallway smelled of old cabbage and damp carpets. It was perfect. We reached our door, and I saw that the mist that the council had used to enter had left the frame slightly warped. I had to give it a solid kick with my heel to get it to open. The apartment was a disaster. The broken percolator was still on the floor. The coffee stain had dried into a dark brown Rorschach test, and there were 3 different drones in various states of disassembly on the kitchen table. Lyra walked to the window and looked out at the city. She didn't look like a queen. She didn't even look like a refugee anymore. She just looked like Lyra. "Kay," she said, her back to me. "Yeah? When Malachor told you what when he told you what the Dust Eater was built for, why didn't you run? Why didn't you believe him?" I set my bag down on the counter and looked at the chipped mug she had left behind. "Because I've lived with you for 5 years, Lyra. I've seen you cry over a dead plant. I've seen you spend 2 hours trying to rescue a bug that got caught in the sink. You don't prune the garden. You're the person who tries to save every single leaf, even the ones that are a little bit brown around the edges." I walked over to the table and picked up a piece of a drone sensor. Malachor knew your DNA. He knew your history. But he didn't know you. He didn't know that you're the kind of person who likes the crack in her mug because it makes it unique. He didn't know that you'd choose a greasy noodle shop over a palace of light any day of the week. She turned around, her eyes wet. I chose you too, Kay. I know, I said, a lump forming in my throat. And that's the only royal decree I'm ever going to follow. We stood there for a long time, just breathing the air of our own lives. The world outside was changing. The empire was falling apart, and the stars were rearranging themselves into something new and uncertain. But in that small, messy room, the grid was stable. I looked at the sink. You know, I said, trying to break the tension. The dishes are still your turn. Lyra wiped her eyes and gave me a playful shove. I just saved the galaxy, Kaylin Vance. I think I've earned a night off from the dishes. Nice try, I said, heading for the kitchen. But in this apartment, we are a democracy, and the people have spoken. She laughed, and the sound was better than any singing staff in the universe. It has been 6 months since the night the sky didn't fall. Neo-Veridia is still Neo-Veridia. The rain is still acidic, the enforcers are still corrupt, and Old Man Jax still charges too much for his extra spicy dumplings. But if you look closely, if you're a grid jumper like me who knows how to read the subtle shifts in the city's energy, you can see the changes. The Wraith ships don't haunt the upper atmosphere anymore. The sovereign news feeds have been replaced by a chaotic, noisy mess of 100 different voices, all arguing about how to build a government that doesn't require a genetic key. It's messy. It's loud. It's occasionally violent. It's exactly what life should be. I spent most of my morning in the sublevels of Sector 4, repairing a series of atmospheric scrubbers that had been choked with industrial soot. It was gritty, back-breaking work, and my shoulder still twinges when the weather gets cold. But as I climbed out of the maintenance hatch and into the street, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known before the spire. I walked home through the crowded market, weaving between groups of humans and Aurelians who were actually talking to each other. No one was bowing. No one was hiding their ears. I stopped at a street vendor and bought a bag of fried dough balls, paying with 2 copper credits that I had earned by fixing a neighbor's heater. It felt better than 1,000 sovereign marks. When I got back to the apartment, the door opened on the first try. I had fixed the frame 3 months ago. The smell of actual, honest-to-God coffee hit me the moment I stepped inside. The percolator was bubbling away on the counter. It was a new model. The Mark 8 I had borrowed from the palace, but I had spent 2 weeks modifying it to make sure it still had a little bit of that old, stubborn personality. It didn't hiss anymore, but it did emit a low, musical hum when the brew was ready. Lyra was at the table, surrounded by paper books. She had started a library for the neighborhood kids, a small, quiet rebellion against the digital sensory overload of the city. She looked up as I walked in, her silver-blue skin glowing in the afternoon light. "You're late," she said, her tail flicking with amusement. "I was starting to think you'd been kidnapped by another interstellar empire." "Not today," I said, dropping my tool bag and grabbing a mug. "Just a stubborn scrubber in Sector 4. How was the Royal Library?" "We had 15 children today," she said, her eyes bright. One of them, a little boy with human ears and Aurelian scales, asked me if the stories about the Queen were true. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that the Queen was a very tired woman who realized that being important was a lot less fun than being useful. I told him that she's much happier now, that she doesn't have to worry about the stars and can focus on the stories." I sat down across from her, sipping my coffee. It was hot, bitter, and perfect. I looked around the room. We had new shelves now, built from sturdy lunar oak. The couch had been cleaned, though the blue soda stain was still visible if you looked at it in the right light. The apartment was still small, still cramped, and still sitting above a noisy noodle shop. But as I looked at Lyra, I realized that I wasn't just a grid jumper anymore. I was a man who had seen the void and chosen the Earth. I was a man who had been offered a galaxy and decided that a cracked mug was worth more. My transformation wasn't something that happened in a flash of light in the star chamber. It happened in the quiet moments that followed. It happened every time I chose to stay when I could have run. Every time I chose to fix a neighbor's life instead of just a circuit. I am a master of the grid, not because I know how to move energy, but because I know where the energy belongs. It belongs in the hands of the people who use it to keep each other warm. It belongs in the hearts of those who choose their family instead of just inheriting it. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the cargo shuttles rise into the purple sky. They weren't weapons anymore. They were just people, going from one place to another, trying to make a living in a universe that had suddenly become much bigger and much more complicated. I spent 32 years thinking that I was a ghost in the machine, a disposable part of a system that didn't know I existed. I thought that safety was found in the shadows, and that being ordinary was a prison sentence. But 5 years with Lyra, and one terrifying trip to the heart of an empire, taught me the most important lesson a human can learn. The ordinary is the only thing that is truly sacred. The universe is vast, cold, and filled with ancient weapons and dying gods, but none of it has the power of a shared meal or a promise kept. I used to think I was saving Lyra by hiding her, but the truth is, she was saving me by showing me that a life lived for others is the only one that doesn't eventually run out of power. I am not a hero. I'm just a guy with a wrench who realized that the most complex technology in the galaxy is the way two people can choose to become an anchor for each other. We are all just ghosts until someone looks at us and decides that we matter. And once you have that, once you have someone who knows your name and your coffee preferences, the rest of the galaxy is just background noise. I turned back to Lyra. She was watching me, her head tilted slightly, her ears catching the light. "Everything okay, Kay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "Everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be." I walked over to the sink and picked up a sponge. I started scrubbing the dishes from breakfast, the soapy water warm against my hands. It was a mundane, repetitive task, and I loved every second of it. I looked over my shoulder at her. I was thinking about Saren and Malachor and all those people in the spire who are still trying to figure out who they are now that the bloodlock is gone. I wonder, in a universe that tells you every day who you are supposed to be based on your birth, your job, or your DNA, who have you chosen to stand by when the stars themselves seem to be falling? Those people who chose to stay when they didn't have to? Have you told them how much they matter lately? Lyra stood up and walked over, leaning her head against my shoulder as I finished the last plate. "I think they know, Kay," she whispered. I rinsed the plate and set it in the rack, the silver-blue light of Ethelgard reflecting off the clean ceramic. The city hummed below us, a messy, beautiful symphony of choice. The broken coffee machine finally stopped blinking, yielding its first perfect cup of the new age. On the table, the old paper book lay open to a story about a girl who became a star, but Lyra was already busy writing a much better one.